I'm done.
Azir just needs to be
I
reworked or
am
buffed,
sick.
and I'm sadly
I'm
quitting.
not
Useless
shit.
and
So
made 10 damage
Azir
early on
shuffle needs to
playable
go.
again.
Azir is
Entirely
actually
takes away
unplayable.
Azir's Azir is literally.
A lot of Azir players are understandably upset with the recent nerfs. This one hit pretty hard, and a lot of people are calling for a mini-rework, and ultimately I think that's a bad idea. I think the downsides to a rework far outweigh the upsides, but we're gonna look at everything, while ignoring arguments along the lines of Azir is useless, just don't play him, or get good, because those don't help anybody. Before we get into it though, I think you should know a bit more about me to understand where my opinions come from. So, my name's Patrick, you can call me Patty. I have 1.8 million mastery points on Azir, and I rarely ever play soloQ. I make sure to reach gold every season for the rewards, but that's about it. And I generally don't watch pro play. I think it's amazing that it exists, I would just rather go play a normal game instead. Now that that's out of the way, what are the main things that a rework should do? A rework should try to increase a champion's popularity, try to fix issues the champion has, and it should make the champion more fun to play, in pro, solo queue, or casual. The goal is to achieve as much of this as possible while keeping the champion's identity intact. So which of these things needs fixing? I don't think anyone's arguing that Azir isn't fun to play. Difficult champions are often popular specifically because of their difficulty. It's just fun to pilot a difficult champion. But Azir isn't exactly what I would call popular, and he has some issues. The main one being the giant gap of effectiveness between pro play and solo queue. Azir works really well in coordinated teams. This makes him great for pro play, but for climbing solo queue, he's not so great. The effort you'd have to put in to climb while one-tricking Azir isn't really worth it compared to the other options. Riot is also forced to balance Azir around pro play, and every nerf will just hurt solo queue that much more. All of this pretty much boils down to Azir being better in pro play than he is in solo queue. Let's go over why that's the case. The first thing that immediately comes to mind is that Azir is difficult and pros are good at the game. Therefore, they can use Azir to his fullest potential, for the most part. But the main reason really is team coordination. If an Azir goes in and hits a 5-man ult and his team is already in position to capitalize on it, it's way more effective. Azir can also sit behind his team and deal damage similar to an ADC. And just like ADCs, it's a lot easier to do if you have teammates that are willing to protect you. Team coordination like this will almost never appear in solo queue, but will always be there in pro play. You can experience this yourself if you play Clash. A lot of champions, including Azir, immediately become better or worse in or against coordinated teams. So that's what needs to be fixed, but we should try to keep Azir's identity intact. So what is Azir? Azir is a control mage, and all of his abilities reflect that. His W essentially creates an area where the enemies will be punished if they walk through it. His Q moves that controlled area somewhere else. His E allows him to reposition, which can open more opportunities to control an area of the map. His ult controls the immediate area around him, and even his passive allows him to control an area of the map. Keeping track of all these abilities while positioning yourself and your soldiers correctly makes Azir extremely difficult, which is another thing that is a part of Azir's identity. Azir is difficult. Generally, Riot's philosophy for making champions is easy to play, but hard to master. Azir is one of the few champions that has a really high skill floor right out the gate. And while nowhere near one of the flashiest champions in the game, he is somewhat known for a certain flashy combo. Azir is also good at a lot of different things. He can be played very offensively and very defensively. He can be a lane bully. He can do a lot of poke damage. He can destroy tanks. He can even engage team fights. And he scales extremely well. Alright, so that was a lot of things that make Azir Azir. And there's one last thing that I want to add before we get into reworks. You wouldn't really know this unless you were an Azir main. But Azir is very personal in his playstyles. Let me explain. Azir has two main playstyles. There's a poke or burst playstyle, and there's a DPS playstyle. From afar, it really only looks like a change of runes, and if you're buying Nash's Tooth or Ludens. Quick side note so I don't get comments about this. Yes, I know you can build Ludens and Nash's Tooth together right now, but it used to be like this and might be like this in the future. but they're actually two completely different ways of playing Azir. Poke Azir is played more like a traditional mage, going for short, high damage trades and one-shots instead of setting up soldiers for the most possible attacks. Some people even go as far as building Night Harvester or taking Dark Harvest to try and one-shot multiple people with a drift. And on the other hand, we have DPS players. DPS players tend to prefer structured teamfights, dealing damage from the backline like an ADC. They try to be very efficient with their soldier placement and queues, trying to get the most possible damage out of each individual soldier. They'll also tend to use their ult more defensively, to peel themselves and such. Keep in mind that this was a broad generalization. Everyone plays Azir in their own personal way, and there isn't really a definitive correct way of playing Azir. Even though in the current meta, poke is definitely better, a lot of people, including me, will stick to DPS Azir just because we find it more enjoyable. Now I know I just spent nearly 2 minutes talking about Azir playstyles, but this is really important to keep in mind when talking about Azir's identity. The way you fundamentally play Azir is personal. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, we can talk about some mini-reworks. Let's start off with the rework that Azir already got. Basically, we lost some range and wave clear, but we got some improved and easier playmaking potential. We also got the potential to do more damage per second. Now for the reworks everyone's been calling for. There's two main mini-reworks that people are calling for. The first and more popular one I will call the Hypercarry rework. This one is basically the opposite of the rework we got in 7.19. This one would want to change or even remove the EQ interaction. And some people are even advocating to change the ultimate. This would remove the flashy playmaking potential that Azir has, and allow Riot to increase his range and buff his overall damage. I'll call this second one the Playmaker rework. This one would almost be an extension of the 7.19 rework. Ideas for this rework usually involve giving something up, like range or damage, for more playmaking potential. This one could also make Azir easier to play, which could make him more popular. Let's start with how the Hypercarry rework would fix Azir's problems. When you take power away from Azir's engage, you make room to buff his range and damage output. This also shifts his identity towards the long-range control mage, which allows him to be more easily balanced around this one theme, because it's the only thing Riot has to look out for. When there's less stuff you have to keep intact while adjusting Azir, you get more room to make things work in pro play and solo queue. Keep in mind, it's not about removing the drift because it's too strong in pro play. It's about changing it and then compensating with buffs that will allow for a smaller gap between pro play and solo queue. An argument brought up a lot for the Hypercarry route is that Azir's E doesn't fit his character, in the sense that he's an emperor and his soldiers should be doing all the work. The last argument that I often see for this rework is that the EQ interaction was originally a bug, and that justifies its removal. I think that this argument is completely invalid. Just because something was originally a bug doesn't mean it shouldn't be a feature. Rocket jumping was originally a bug in the game Quake, but it was turned into a feature and basically spawned movement shooters as a genre. But all things considered, I think this rework is not a good idea. Azir just won't be the same to some people. This rework heavily favors DPS players, while kinda leaving poke players in the dust. Even though there's a lot of poke mages out there, none of them can engage like Azir. And people who enjoy Azir specifically because of that will quit playing him. This will make a split in the player base that we really don't want to have, similar to what happened to Aurelion Soul. So now, how does the Playmaker rework fix Azir? Well, it pretty much has the same potential to fix the pro play solo queue gap, but it changes his identity in the opposite direction. This one also does have the added benefit of potentially making Azir flashier and also easier. I say easier because consistently being able to drift isn't what's hard about Azir. Positioning and soldier placement is the real time sink when it comes to learning Azir. And because of that, it will probably garner more new players than the other option. But I think that this rework is also a bad idea. Just like the Hypercarry route, this rework creates a split in the player base. This time it just favors the poke players. And DPS players like me will end up quitting Azir. But that's not all the identity that gets removed with this rework. Because I would argue that Azir being one of the most difficult champions in the game is a part of his identity, which has the potential to be taken away with this rework. It will also almost certainly remove his ability to be a DPS mage, which is a characteristic I really think he should keep, especially because we're losing DPS mages. So those were the two most popular rework ideas. Let's quickly go over some less popular ones. One of them is making the champion easier in some way, shape, or form. Personally, I think a big part of Azir's character is his difficulty, and I think taking that away will do more harm than good. Another one of the ideas is turning Azir into a burst mage. While this route could let you keep the playmaking potential, I think this would make a lot of people upset, even though building him like a burst mage is what's meta right now. And last, but definitely not least, a passive rework. This is the only kind of rework that I would find acceptable, because I don't think anybody's gonna quit Azir over losing the current passive. Even though the passive fits his character quite well, I don't think it's too much to give up in order to make him a bit better in soloQ. But how do we change the passive to make him better for soloQ? Well, I don't know. There aren't a lot of passive rework ideas out there. It may not even be possible. That's why I think the best course of action is just to do nothing. Leave Azir the way he is. Let me just get this out of the way real quick. I don't think banning or restricting Azir in pro play is a good idea. That'll just create its own set of weird problems. Alright, look, I know, the nerfs hurt, but losing huge chunks of our champion's identity is gonna hurt even more. And as long as Azir is Azir, he's gonna have these problems. His problems are rooted in his identity, meaning you have to remove it to remove all the problems. And while these reworks can keep a lot of his identity intact while fixing the problems a bit, you end up giving up a lot of identity for a small amount of soloQ power. And while the passive rework would only remove a little bit of identity, I'm also not even sure if you can make it work, meaning it still follows that ratio of how much identity you give up for how much power. The Hypercarry and Playmaker reworks I talked about earlier could actually give a reasonable amount of soloQ power, but both of these remove huge chunks of his identity and split the Azir player base to the point where a lot of people are going to be quitting. I don't think any amount of soloQ power is worth cutting the already small player base in half. And let's be real for a second, it's not like there isn't any Azir one-tricks in high elo. He's certainly not the best champion for climbing, but it's not impossible to do so. No matter how much you change Azir, as long as some of his core identity is intact, he's always going to be better in pro play, just because how well he works with team coordination. But even besides all of that, Azir is such an amazing and unique champion. I think dealing with nerfs is a small price to pay to keep all of Azir's identity intact. To make my last point, I quickly want to talk about the Aurelion Soul rework. The goal was to nerf him in pro play and make it easier for newer players to pick him up. They made sure to keep his roaming ability intact, but they also ended up changing him from a DPS mage into a burst mage. And since then I've completely stopped playing him. And so have many other people. Old Aurelion Soul and Azir are quite similar, and I really think an Azir rework has huge potential to fail in the same ways. And those are all the reasons why I think Azir should not be reworked. Thank you so much for watching. And if you disagree or think I missed anything, feel free to comment below. I'd love to hear all your thoughts. I've also never made a video like this before, so any feedback would be greatly appreciated. Alternatively, you could also join my Discord server. We've got quite a few people who are very passionate about Azir and love discussing anything about him. Also, a huge thanks to these three. This video would not have been possible without them. Yeah, I think that's about it. Thanks again for watching, and oh, hang on. I just had another idea that could fix all of Azir's problems. Add voice chat. Can we please stop with the military jets? Why do we even have these?